Well, I think it may be difficult to imagine because I must say that anybody who is looking what is happening at this point in Gaza, um, I mean, this is just unbelievable in terms of, you know, I think it's really important that people do not push it aside because, you know, the killing which is going on under the pretext of getting rid of Hamas, bombing refugee camps and defenseless civilians, killing thousands of children. I mean, the world has to wake up because I really want to say that uh, the enormousness of what is going on is very, very difficult to cope with. And I would really urge people who are listening to this broadcast, to engage in actually what is happening and not brush it aside with the idea, whatever ready-made opinions you may have, because I think that this is really the test of morality of mankind if we can stop this. I think the fact that the UN Human Rights Commissioner Volker Türk just sent in his resignation because he said that once again the United Nations proved to be powerless in front of this, and then he says that he has been involved in observing and dealing with many genocides. He said he was involved with the genocide against the Tutsis, the Bosnian Muslims, the Yazidi, the Rohingya, but that this is by far the worst. And I want to read you a whole quote of what he said. He said, "This is a textbook case of genocide. The European ethno-nationalist settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase towards the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine. What's more, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and much of Europe are wholly complicit in the horrific assault. Not only are these governments refusing to meet their treaty obligations to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions, but they are in fact actively arming the assault, providing economic and intelligence support, and giving political and diplomatic cover for Israel's atrocities." Now, I think this is very important because it has been created a climate where, in some places like Germany, for example, you cannot even discuss these things anymore. And now slowly it starts to change. But for the first days of what happened, there was a complete gag order. You could not express any concern for the plight of the Palestinians without being accused of being anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. And the two things are not the same thing. In Israel, the support for the Gaza invasion dropped from 69% after October 7th to now somewhere around 20%. So the Israeli population is not behind that. So I think it's really important that we mobilize the population because this has to stop. There has to be a worldwide mobilization of people who are stepping in, because if we don't stop it, it does have the potential to lead to the end of civilization, because we are on the verge of World War III. I mean, it's very obvious that the whole Southwest Asian region is a powder keg. There are already reports that, some other countries are involved one way or another, be it that Israel bombed targets in Syria, be it that bombs came or missiles or drones came from Yemen to Israel. I cannot verify any of these, but it is very clear that we are sitting on a complete powder keg. There are many politicians who now basically talk about a new axis of evil, involving Iran. And it is very clear that the moment Iran would be involved in this conflict, all charts are off. I mean, we are on the verge of a total escalation. A very important Russian, his name is Fyodor Lukyanov. He's the chairman of the Council of Foreign and Defense Policy and also the program director of the Valdai Club. He basically said this is already a new world war. And he also noted that this is the breakdown of the international order, that the previous order, which was characterized by mutual assured destruction, actually, especially in the Cold War period when the Soviet Union still existed, the conflicts, could be managed because it was clear that mutual assured destruction was a deterrence for anybody to engage in an escalation. But that has broken down. And he says that he doesn't see anymore even a temporary approach to settlement. And I think that's a quite accurate description. I mean, it's very clear that what is really behind all of that is completely different. It's not about Ukraine. It's not about Southwest Asia. Sure, the predicates of these conflicts are extremely important and they play a role. But I think President Putin, in a meeting with some security people, said, these are geopolitical manipulations which are really behind all of that. And I think that that is absolutely true, because what's really at stake is that you have a collapsing old order, the idea of an unipolar world where the West would be the dominant force, and the global South would have no role. I mean, that is changing. That is irreversibly changed because you have the emergence of a new system of economic relations with the BRICS-Plus, the global South countries working with these countries, and the absolute desperate attempt by the forces of the West to prevent such a new order from taking control of the situation. So I think we are in the most dangerous moment in the history of mankind ever. The old order is breaking apart. A new order is emerging, but it's not yet settled. And as long as the West is desperately trying to contain the emergence of such a new order, I think we are on the verge of a complete catastrophe. And, I think that we really have to have a mobilization where everybody should join peace demonstrations. It's not about taking sides. We have to catapult the whole situation into a new geometry, a new paradigm. And I think, what I have proposed, the moment the special military operation in Ukraine started, the war in Ukraine, which is now more than 1.5 years ago, I called for a new paradigm, a new international security and development architecture, because it was clear that you cannot settle things within the old order by nature, because that's the way how this thing is breaking apart. You need to move to a new security and development architecture which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. Now, applied to the Ukraine crisis, this means you have to take care of the security interest of Ukraine, but also of Russia. In Southwest Asia, it means you have to take into account the security interest of Israel, but also of Palestine, also of Iran, also of the other countries in the region. And that jump to understand the lessons of the Peace of Westphalia, that peace is only possible if you take care of the interest of the other, that has, for many regions of the world, like Europe, gone completely absent. Nobody is thinking that way anymore. Germany says we are on the side of Israel, no matter what. Well, that does not serve Israel well because, as you can see, that what the pathway which is now started, or which is now put into motion, could lead to a complete catastrophe for everybody. So you are not doing anybody a favor by pushing that. The same is true essentially for the situation in Ukraine. So I think it's high time to discuss the new security and development architecture. And I really challenge people to start to enter into a discussion process with us. How can we promote that? How can we get a couple of countries, a couple of universities, a couple of think tanks to actually start to discuss how can we give ourselves an order which allows the survival of mankind? Or are we so stupid that we pursue the pathway to our own extinction? I'm an optimist, and therefore I think it can be done, but it requires, the mobilization of a lot of people around the globe.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Project for November 4th. Our show today is titled Hope, Not Tragedy, Toward a Solution in Southwest Asia. You've just heard Helga LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, and an evaluation and assessment that she gave earlier this week for a webcast that she held. Today marks the 28th anniversary of the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who defied history by deciding to not be a tragic figure and to seek peace with the Palestinians. He famously was the architect of the Oslo Accords, and in the course of that, he made a statement in 1995, 2 years after the Oslo Accords were concluded, when he was at a meeting with President Bill Clinton and King Hussein of Jordan. And he said this as a toast: "If I raise my toast, I will raise it for those who have the courage to change their axioms, to overcome prejudices, to change realities, to all those who believe and support and are ready to assist the continuation of peace in the region." Like Chaim. Now, by November 4th of 1995, he would be felled by an Israeli assassin deployed by the same people who were responsible, generically speaking, for September 11th of 2001 in this country and the subsequent wars of retribution and hegemonism fought by the United States and the Anglo-American establishment in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Now, today, things are different. There is a new alliance in the world, sometimes referred to as the BRICS alliance: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But there are additional nations that have joined that alliance, among them Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, all of whom are going to, as of next month, be full members of that alliance. This has caused a great amount of consternation among the old Anglo-American imperial forces, who don't see the idea of economic development as the basis for peace as being either the prerogative or, shall we say, the option that these nations are allowed to assert on their own. Southwest Asia, which has now being desecrated once again by the kind of violence that shocks the world, has to be transformed into a crossroads of world cooperation among differing faiths, cultures, and nations, ending the era of Anglo-American imperialism forever. We're here today to discuss that, how that process would come about. But in order to give some background as to some of the, if you will, deeper history to that, we will also supply here a brief excerpt from a speech given by Lyndon LaRouche back in 2008, discussing the issue of World War III and its prospects, and how it is that this old, desiccated, dying, and diseased imperialism and colonialism of the British imperial time has condemned the world, even at this late date, to a potential thermonuclear extinction.
There's another issue here. There's also an issue of World War III. And World War III is between the British Empire, better known as the Anglo-Dutch liberal banking financial system on the one side, and the principal nations of Eurasia, Russia, China, India, and other nations are the targets of intended warfare by the British Empire, which is already turning Europe into continental Europe into a mere colony of the British Empire through the program of the Lisbon Treaty. If the Lisbon Treaty were adopted, and is being pushed for adoption now, there would not be a single nation on the continent of Europe, west of Belarus and Russia, which had any sovereignty whatsoever. The British Empire would control the entirety of that region of Europe, from Portugal to the borders of Belarus and Russia, as a puppet of the Anglo-Dutch liberal financial interests. It is those interests represented in the United States who have, for a long time, especially since 1971-72, have taken over control of the U.S. dollar, control of the United States. Now they're moving in for the kill. And that's the issue. The issue is the fools think that in the Democratic Party, the people at the top are generally largely corrupt in this thing. They're lying their heads off. I watched some of them lie on television. I watched all the commentators, the television commentators lying like hell about what was going on right under their nose on television. And you could see the facts and you could see what they were saying. Two different things. But you're looking at a war between an empire run by London, not necessarily all the British people, but it's by the Anglo-Dutch liberal financier cartel. The same cartel that put Mussolini into power in Italy, the same cartel that put Hitler into power in Germany. And we're now at the brink of something like a Hitler power taking over the United States. If they grab the United States, then they will grab all of Europe under the Lisbon Treaty. If they control the United States and the parts of Europe under the Lisbon Treaty, then you will have an actual fighting war emerging on this planet against the continent of Africa and much of the continent of Asia and other places. You will have dictatorship. You will have mass starvation, the elimination of whole sections of the population of parts of the world through starvation. And that's part of the British program. It's the food war. We now have a situation which I'll get into on the background. But that's the situation. We're not dealing with an election. We're dealing with whether there is in the United States, in the top layers of society, the moral fitness to survive. And so far, the vote is in the leadership of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Neither is morally fit to survive. They're as unmorally fit to survive as the people who backed Mussolini and backed Hitler back in the 1920s and the 1930s. And if we allow this to happen, we will get the same kind of treatment that the victims of Mussolini, Hitler, and so forth suffered. That's where we stand. We have to win this war against that evil empire. That's been the long-standing fight. For me, it's a long-standing fight ever since I've had service in Asia toward the end of the last World War, where I was in northern Burma, now called Myanmar, and in Calcutta area, in Bengal. And I saw the British Empire face up in those circumstances and elsewhere. I know the British Empire. Truman was a victim of the British Empire. Look at there's just a case of this thing. Franklin Roosevelt's intention at the close of World War II, before he died, his intention at that period, was to eliminate colonialism and all forms of imperialism for this planet. His intention was that once the peace had been secured, that the power of the United States, developed through its agro-industrial and scientific power, which is the greatest power this planet had ever seen from any single source, that this power was going to be used by converting the war machine, which the United States had assembled to deal with the war against Hitler, to assemble that machine and transform it into a machine of production. And as Roosevelt spelled out specifically, to take nations and continents like Africa, the colonial nations of the world, and free them not only by giving them political freedom, but by giving them economic assistance and technology to solve their problems, where they could emerge from being colonies and prey to being essentially self-determining. And Roosevelt's intention for the United Nations was to perform a receptacle called the United Nations as an assembly of nations, including many which would be newly created as freed from former colonies to sovereign national status. And the minute that pig, Truman, walked in to replace Roosevelt, within hours after Roosevelt's death, Truman went to the side of Churchill. Truman supported the British. Indochina, which had been freed by its own efforts with the support of the United States under Ho Chi Minh, under Roosevelt. This nation, the Japanese who had surrendered to the Vietnamese, suddenly were on orders of London, with the support of Harry Truman, were freed. The Japanese soldiers were given their guns back and taken out of the camps to reoccupy Indochina, to turn it over to the British immediately, who would then turn it over to their suckers, the French. Look at that whole region. Indonesia. The Indonesian people had largely freed themselves from Japanese and Dutch occupation. And what did we do? The Anglo-Americans reinforced the colonization of Indonesia. Finally, the Indonesians got a conditional freedom, but their essential freedom was to be taken away from them. A similar thing happened in India. India got a qualified freedom, but the British kept a stranglehold on it, as Nehru saw at the time when the rupee was devalued, and India was put into a condition of slavery as a result. That's the condition in Africa. That's the condition of Southwest Asia. That's the conditions that were imposed wherever the United States was weak, in South and Central America. And so we went from a nation that we had been to a Truman nation, a nation which was a lackey of the British Empire. This is what the problem is. And people say, how can you talk about the British that way? They're our cousins. Well, see, it's not really the British. That's another story, which I won't go into here. But essentially, what we call the British Empire, or the Anglo-Dutch liberal financier empire, is an Anglo-Dutch operation based on Venice, which is a syndicate of financiers, individual financiers who, in a group, form a kind of a locust horde.
That last section of what Lyndon LaRouche talked about, and if you're just joining us, welcome to today's LaRouche Organization Manhattan Project show. It's entitled Hope, Not Tragedy, Toward a Solution in Southwest Asia. But people want to talk about 1948 in Palestine, and they talk about how, well, to understand what's going on right now in what they call the Middle East, we have to look at 1948. Well, actually, no, you have to look at April 12th, 1945, the death of Franklin Roosevelt, and then look at, as Belinda LaRouche just walked you through, what happened in Vietnam, what happened in Indonesia, what happened in India, and then look at what happened in Palestine. And then you can begin to look at the envelope of transition, which was different than the transition intended by Franklin Roosevelt, rather than a transition in which Dutch colonialism, French colonialism, Portuguese, Belgian, and British colonialism are eliminated. In fact, those colonialisms were reinforced, and that was called the Cold War. It was not a question of communism. It was a question of the reimposition of the forms of imperialism that were to be eliminated at the end of the war. That was not entirely successful. Yes, there was a degree of freedom that was gained by various nations, but the conflict we're looking at right now in the area of Southwest Asia has its spawn in something larger, a larger envelope of a problem that is also plagued United States foreign policy, to the extent that you can even call it U.S. foreign policy, especially as it has been applied since the period of September 11th. In a series of no-win wars, intentionally no-win wars, and the extension of that same policy of no-win warfare into today's Southwest Asian conflict, as with the so-called Ukraine conflict. Now, to discuss these matters and discuss the solution to this outlook, we have two guests today, the Harley Schlanger, from the spokesman for the LaRouche organization, and Professor Cliff Kirikoff. We're going to hear from Harley first and then go to Cliff right after Harley. So, Harley?
Well, thank you, Dennis, and hello to everyone. In keeping with Helga's statement of the need for optimism, I'm titling my presentation today, "The Truth Will Prevail." And I'm taking this from a very somewhat well-known Yiddish proverb, which says, "The truth never dies, but it lives a wretched life." In discussing the situation in Southwest Asia at a LaRouche Youth Movement cadre school in the early 2000s with Lyndon LaRouche, after I cited that proverb, he had some comments that I think are highly relevant for what we're going to be talking about today. And this is a paraphrase from my old notes, but he said, "Our job is not just to keep the truth alive, but to invigorate the minds of people trapped by false axioms, so they'll become open to new ideas and thereby be able to discover the truth." Now, this is a critical approach to overcoming a method which is being deployed in the form of hybrid warfare to disorient, to confuse, to demoralize people, to keep them from taking up the big ideas that were typified by the writings and speeches of Lyndon LaRouche, and more recently, continuing that through the work of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, including her approach to the strategic crisis by saying that we have to overcome geopolitics, and to do that, we need a new security and development architecture. So as we look at a situation where many, many people have been running from reality, trying to hide from the truth of the genocide in Ukraine, the genocide in Southwest Asia, what Helga is saying is, don't run from these horrors. Face reality and fight for the truth, and fight for it with courage. And take the examples that we're going to discuss today as particularly Yitzhak Rabin, who was murdered 28 years ago on this day. And to overcome geopolitics, you have to recognize where geopolitics comes from. Many people use the term geopolitics to describe strategic thinking. And what you find is that in most of these people, there's no strategic thinking at all. It's just the piecing together bits and pieces and connecting dots, and essentially accepting a method which goes back specifically, and you can trace this to the British Empire from the middle, at the latest, the middle of the 19th century. But in particular, it was the method of the British imperial establishment, which was essentially the monarchy and the lords and ladies of the City of London. And since the end of World War I, they've recruited the U.S. establishment, the leading families of Wall Street and New York City, through institutions, and especially since World War II. FDR was a break in that, but after World War II, the Anglo-American establishment has been the center of the empire. Now, all of you are familiar with the narratives put out by this empire, but I'm just going to review them briefly before I go into the background to what's happening now in Southwest Asia. Take, for example, the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. What's the story here? Well, we're told Ukraine wants peace. Ukraine is a democracy. That they were subjected to an unprovoked attack by Russia on February 22nd, 2022. That this was because Putin is an authoritarian. He's trying to reconstitute the Russian Empire. And if he's not stopped in Ukraine, he will conquer Europe. And therefore, we have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to stop it. Now, this leaves out the larger truth, which is that this minimally goes back to the decline and fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the constant push from NATO eastward against Russia, the attempt to weaken and destroy Russia as a, quote, strategic adversary, unquote. And that's the reality that's left out when people talk about what happened in Ukraine. They leave out what happened with the US support of the regime change in 2014. They lie that there are no Nazi networks in Ukraine involved in this, and so on. So the same thing is the case in the Middle East. We're told Hamas is ISIS, that they're barbarians, and certainly the attack on October 7th had elements of barbarism. But at the same time, the argument that therefore anything Israel wants to do is justified to guarantee their security also leaves out the reality of many, many years of manipulation of the Arab population, the Palestinian Arab population, and the Israeli population, manipulation from above by essentially the same lords and ladies of London that manipulated the situation in the Middle East with the Sykes-Picot Treaty of dividing the nations up, dividing the region up between France and the United Kingdom, the Balfour Declaration, and so on. And you can go through an extensive review of this and realize that what we're seeing is the people in Israel, the Jewish population of Israel, the Arab Palestinian population of the occupied territories, and by extension into the Arab world, people who have been manipulated by narratives hatched from the City of London and backed up by the firepower of the United States and NATO. So what we're seeing, though, in spite of their effort to run hybrid warfare to confuse and disorient and demoralize the populations of the West, is reality is breaking through the wall of lies. And truth is emerging. We're seeing it, for example, in Ukraine. Grudging admission that in spite of all the money and all the efforts of the West, the counteroffensive is failing. And that the emergence of a Nazi in the Canadian Parliament who is identified as a Ukrainian freedom fighter, the embarrassment and scandal of that made clear that there's a cover-up of who actually is running the situation inside Ukraine and the role of NATO, the United Kingdom, and the US to manipulate Ukraine against Russia. And so there is opposition growing to the support of this proxy war against Russia. In fact, there was a report on NBC television which said there quoted sources from inside the administration saying that there are, quote, quiet talks with the Ukrainian government about peace negotiations. Well, this is obviously a reaction to the opposition that's growing and the failure of the strategy. But why did it take 1.5 years to talk about negotiations? Because the strategy from the beginning has been to weaken and defeat Russia as a strategic adversary. Instead of negotiating with Russia and finding common interest, including for the countries of Europe, which have essentially committed economic suicide on behalf of the Anglo-American interests. And since this didn't happen when there could have been an agreement in March 2022, which was sabotaged by the Biden administration and NATO, how many Ukrainians have died for the purpose of this proxy war? How many Russians have died? How many people in Europe are suffering because of the economic consequences? Now, similarly, we're seeing growing support for a ceasefire in Gaza. And it's not from supporters and defenders of Hamas and pro-terrorist anti-Semites. It's coming from people in Israel, inside Israel, who know who Netanyahu is, that he's nothing but a thug acting on behalf of these families of the British Empire. that there are people demonstrating in Western European cities, today in Washington, D.C., all over the United States. Many of them are Jewish Americans who in some cases are being called anti-Semites by those who are trying to control the narrative. So since when did calling for peace between the people of Israel and the Palestinian population, since when does that make one an anti-Semite? Now, I want to review some elements of the situation, especially related to the life and work of Yitzhak Rabin and also the death of Yitzhak Rabin, who provides an example for leaders today who are stuck in this geopolitical trap and don't seem to be able to find a way out. And I'm going to give you some quotes that are from an article I wrote in August 2006, which was published in the Executive Intelligence Review, called The Westphalian Principle from Madrid to Oslo. Because when you get an inside sense of what was involved in the shift in Rabin's thinking, you'll see that there's a possibility for that to occur across the board today. And as reality strikes, maybe it won't happen with people like Biden, Schultz, Macron, but you never know, because very few people thought that Rabin would be the one who reached across the battlefield and shook hands with Yasser Arafat, or that Arafat would do that with Rabin. So let's just start with the Madrid conference, which opened in October 1991. Now, the Madrid conference was essentially pushed by the United States because there had been growing tension, growing problems, and the Israelis were demanding a $10 billion loan guarantee from the United States. So the Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, who was not exactly a promoter of peace, the Bush administration said that if Israel wanted those loan guarantees, they should sit down and meet with their Arab neighbors. Now, Shamir, who was the prime minister of Israel at that time, who was a close ally of Netanyahu and the Greater Israel fanatics, had no intention of negotiating for peace. He said, you can't talk to the Palestinians because they're bloodthirsty, they have no desire for peace. And so he excluded Palestinians from being there, except as part of the Arab nations delegations that were meeting in Madrid. Now, if I can get the first slide, I have a quote from a representative of the Palestinians who was at that conference, Dr. Haider Abdel Shafi. And listen to what he said. He said, in the name of the Palestinian people, we wish to directly address the Israeli people with whom we have had a prolonged exchange of pain. Let us share hope instead. We are willing to live side by side on the land and the promise of the future. Sharing, however, requires two partners willing to share as equals. Mutuality and reciprocity must replace domination and hostility for general reconciliation and coexistence to occur. Your security and ours are mutually dependent, as intertwined as the fears and nightmares of our children. Now, this was from a representative of the Palestinians, of the Arafat movement, supposedly people who had no interest in peace. Now, in response to this, Shamir made clear that he had no intention of negotiating. In fact, what Shamir said was that there was no agreement in his government to take seriously such statements. They called the statement of Dr. Shafi a Trojan horse, a fake statement. And Shamir, who was a follower of Jabotinsky, Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of the Greater Israel School, of which Netanyahu is a rabid proponent. Shamir had been a member of the Stern Gang, a terrorist movement in Israel, the so-called right-wing extremists, the forerunner of the settlers movement today. And Shamir, during the election campaign in 1992, when he was coming under fire for not negotiating seriously, said this at a memorial meeting of members of the Stern Gang, the old terrorist group that he belonged to. And by the way, he was a proponent of continual conflict. And listen to what he said. "We still need the truth today, the truth of the power of war. Or at least we need to accept that war is inescapable, because without this, the life of the individual has no purpose and the nation has no chance of survival." This is what is called the iron wall of the Jabotinskyites, which essentially said the only basis for truth would be the submission of the Arab population of Israel, the Palestinian Arabs, the submission to second-class citizenship and the idea that Israeli military power will keep them down until they accept that. That's the so-called Iron Wall. Now, Shamir then went on after losing the election, and he lost the election to Yitzhak Rabin, who had been prime minister earlier but made a comeback after 12 years. Shamir said on the Madrid conference that he would have carried on autonomy talks for 10 years. And meanwhile, we would have reached 500,000 people in Judea and Samaria, in other words, on the occupied territories. So the idea was to continue the talks while more and more of the land that had been promised to the Palestinians was taken over by Israeli settlers. Now, in that context, then, you have Rabin's campaign in 1992. And what was he calling for? Well, he called for Palestinian self-government within 6 months to a year. In other words, pulling the Israeli forces out of Gaza and the West Bank and giving self-government to the Palestinians. Secondly, allow residents of East Jerusalem, who had been excluded from the Madrid talks, to be allowed to participate in the Palestinian negotiation teams. So an open dialogue. And finally, he called for a freeze in building settlements. Now, this was in 1992. Now, the result of that was that Arafat, by September of 93, renounced terrorism and recognized the state of Israel. And so Rabin's change from the Shamir tactics had an immediate effect in the Palestinian population. Now, what Rabin said about the Madrid process was that it needed to be revived. What he said is, we inherited the framework of the Madrid conference, but there is one significant change. The previous government created the tools, but it never intended to use them in order to advance peace. And so by shifting out of the Shamir approach, they had hoped to get a breakthrough at Madrid, but it didn't happen. And that was the origin of the negotiations that took place as a back channel in Oslo between representatives of Rabin and Shimon Peres with representatives of Yasser Arafat. And one of those Israeli negotiators was named Yuri Savir. And he had some very interesting comments about his experience when he sat down and started talking to the Palestinians. What Savir said is that he was surprised by the degree of Palestinian interest in economic ties with Israel. Because as we've been pointing out, what changed with Oslo was the recognition that peace is not just saying we're not going to fight anymore, but requires a mutual benefit which can be achieved through working together for economic advance. Savir said he was surprised by the Palestinian interest. They saw such cooperation not just as beneficial to their economy, but as a bridge to regional development. Now, this was really quite crucial, as was pointed out by the author Avi Shlaim, who wrote a book called The Iron Wall, which discusses the problem in revisionist Zionism, which essentially is the Jabotinsky view that you can only have peace by suppression and perpetual conflict. What he said is that before Oslo, quote, national movements, Jewish and Palestinian, denied the other the right to self-determination in Palestine. Their history was one of mutual denial and mutual rejection. Now, under Rabin, mutual denial made way for mutual recognition, however grudging. Now, this is where you see the importance of one leader breaking out of the axiomatic framework. And that's what Rabin did. The Oslo Accord incorporated ideas which had been put forward in the mid-'80s by Shimon Peres and others in his new Marshall Plan, but was advanced by the writings of Lyndon LaRouche in the development of the Oslo Plan. And we have a new pamphlet on the Oslo Plan, which is available, and I think we'll have it in the description section because you can download it and read it. But it goes through a series of articles by LaRouche in the 80s and 90s, where he put forward the idea of mutual economic benefit, the idea from the Peace of Westphalia, as the basis for overcoming the hatred and the violence. Now, what was it that changed that allowed Oslo to work? Well, Rabin had been the Minister of Defense during the First Intifada, when there was a Palestinian uprising, which was mostly young people throwing rocks and disrupting traffic and demonstrating the unwillingness to accept the idea of no rights. And Rabin, as the head of the Israel Defense Forces, stepped in, or actually I think he was the Minister of Defense then, he stepped in and told the soldiers to use force to break it up, not lethal force, but to use clubs, to use whatever methods they need to clear the streets, to jail people, to threaten them. They demolished houses. They did several other things. It was pretty brutal, suppression. But Rabin came to see that that was not a solution. Now, this is expressed clearly by him when he spoke in September 1993 at the White House at the signing of the Oslo Accord with Yasser Arafat present and with Bill Clinton. And here's what he said. I think Dennis quoted some of this before, but he said, "Let me say to you, the Palestinians, we are destined to live together on the same soil and the same land. We, the soldiers who have returned from battles stained with blood, we who have seen our relatives and friends killed before our eyes, we who have attended their funerals and cannot look into the eyes of their parents, we who have come from a land where parents bury their children, we who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today in a loud and clear voice, enough of blood and tears, enough. We have no desire for revenge. We harbor no hatred towards you. We, like you, are people. People who want to build a home, to plant a tree, to love, live side by side with you in dignity, in affinity, as human beings, as free men. We are today giving peace a chance and saying to you and saying again to you, enough. Let us pray that a day will come when we will all say, farewell to arms." And he concluded by saying, "We wish to open a new chapter in the sad book of our lives together, a chapter of mutual recognition, of good neighborliness, of mutual respect, of understanding. We hope to embark on a new era in the history of the Middle East." Now, that was Rabin's approach, which was incorporated into the Oslo Accord. The idea that to live together side by side, there needed to be something that cemented it, an idea that would demonstrate that potential for love and the respect for the dignity of the other. And that's what was incorporated in the economic annexes of Oslo. Now, he repeated something very similar to this when he signed an agreement with King Hussein on July 25th, 1995, again in the presence of Bill Clinton. He said, "If I raise my toast, I will raise it to those who have the courage to change axioms, to overcome prejudices, to change realities, and those who make it possible to them. For you, Your Majesty, King Hussein, to you, President Clinton, to all those who believe and support and are ready to assist the continuation of peace in the region, l'chaim, l'chaim, to life, to life." Now, this was a profound statement, and it expressed the significant change in Rabin, who had been a warrior, had been a fighter. He was in the 1948 war. He was the commander in the 1967 war of the IDF. His life was dedicated to security and defense of Israel, and he had adopted the outlook of the Iron Wall, that Israel's defense and security depended on military power over the Arab Palestinian people. But he changed. And in the next post, you'll see what Leah Rabin's idea of this was. What was the cause of the change? Leah Rabin wrote a beautiful book, Rabin, Our Life, His Legacy, where she goes through in powerful terms this whole question of the change that occurred to him, in him, after his role in suppressing the Intifada. She wrote, "The Intifada made it wholly clear to Yitzhak that Israel could not govern another people. By 1989, he was gradually moving toward advocating Palestinian autonomy and self-determination. And when he came under attack from opponents such as Netanyahu, who were out in the streets calling him a Hitler, a traitor, someone who is committing treason against the Jews and violating the contract that God made to give the Jews the land of Israel." That's the language that was used against him. She quoted Rabin when Netanyahu denounced him for considering Arafat a partner in peace. He responded by saying, "You make peace with your enemies, not with your friends." And that was his approach. Now, the period after that, shortly after the meeting with King Hussein in Washington, on November 4th, 1995, Rabin was assassinated by Yigal Amir, who was influenced by the environment of fanatical rabbis and settlers who insisted that the land, including the occupied land, was given to the Jews by God. And this kind of fundamentalism was firing the passions of the people who became the settlers, that this is our land and we have to fight for it. And the person who shot and killed Rabin came out of that environment, Yigal Amir. This idea of the contract between God and the Jews is at the center of not just Jewish fundamentalism, but Christian fundamentalism. And I think Cliff will talk about that a little bit because he's an expert on it and has written extensively about it. Now, let me have the next post, because Leah Rabin had some very trenchant comments about Netanyahu. In 1998, this was 3 years after her husband had been killed, she said, "I hope, pray that the days of this government, the Netanyahu government, are numbered. Benjamin Netanyahu is a corrupt individual, a contentious liar who is ruining everything that is good about our society. He is breaking it to bits, and in the future, we will have to rebuild it all over." And then later in 1999, she said of Netanyahu, we all want this nightmare to end, that this monstrosity called Netanyahu will get lost because he exhausted our patience a long time ago. The historian Avi Shlaim, who I quoted earlier, had a comment about Netanyahu, which I think characterizes who he is as an operative deployed on behalf of this imperial faction. Now, I can't tell you whether Netanyahu knows that that's what he's doing, but in effect, the idea of dividing the Middle East into squabbling ethnicities, religions, nations, and so on, is part of the blueprint of geopolitics to allow the imperial powers to control the trade routes, the finances, and so on. And what Chaim said of Netanyahu, he is, quote, a proponent of the doctrine of permanent conflict, permanent warfare. That's the policy of this empire, to prevent the emergence of an alternative security architecture and development architecture through war, through regime change, through assassination. Now, in this context, we see the constant actually, one more thing that's important to note, or two more footnotes. In 2001, Netanyahu bragged to settlers he was meeting with, quote, I de facto put an end to the Oslo Accords, unquote. So he identified himself as the father of the movement that shattered the Oslo Accords following the assassination of Rabin, in fact, including the assassination of Rabin. And we now know very well that since 2009, Netanyahu went further, funding Hamas with what's said to be $1 billion through Qatar to build up Hamas as an alternative to the legacy of Arafat and the Palestinian Authority, to divide the Palestinians, to ensure that there would never be a two-state solution, that there would never be an independent Palestinian state. That's who Netanyahu is. Now, I want to conclude by presenting some statements from Lyndon LaRouche, which get to the alternative and why there can be hope, why it is that the Westphalian principle is still alive despite the efforts of Tony Blair and his controllers from London to end the era of Westphalia through the imposition of a unipolar order. Lynn wrote an article in 1977, so this was long before Oslo, for Israel and Palestine magazine, and the article was titled A Future for the Middle East. And here's, I think, a comment which will give you an indication of how Lynn was thinking about how you break out of this geopolitical control. He wrote, quote, poor Palestinian Arabs squatting in misery along Israel's borders are not the solution. What is wanted is sovereign nations undergoing effective internal economic development. If Israel, Lebanon, and a Palestinian Arab state have the same objective policies and basic interests, that is, the mobilizations of their populations through an inspiring process of economic development, then we have the basis for a durable agreement, and not otherwise. Now, as some in Israel began to realize that economic agreement would be essential to achieve peace, we had Shimon Peres in the mid-'80s put forward what he called a new Marshall Plan. And Lynn wrote a memo about this on May 23rd, 1986, in which he discussed what became known as his Oasis Plan. And he wrote about the idea that this is not just about economics, but it's about a philosophical conception of what is the nature of man. And if I can have the next post, I'll show you what he wrote. He wrote, do we have that, the final post? Well, I'll read it if we can't put it up. He said, in the relations between Arab and Jew in the Middle East, we discern two opposing cultural movements among each. On the one side, there is the heritage of the Arab Renaissance, that is the classical Platonic movement within the Arab world in the 12th and 13th century. On the other side, the Sufism, that is basically fundamentalism, which destroyed that Renaissance from within. Post-Hitler Judaism is of two general views. The one bases itself optimistically on 2,000 years of Jewish survival under the diaspora. The other takes Hitler's Holocaust pessimistically as its point of departure. In other words, what you basically have is the victimization expressed in Sufism and in the radical Greater Israel theory, which defines Jewish identity as shaped by the Holocaust. It actually reflects another Yiddish proverb, which is one God and so many enemies. Now, he went on to say, the cultural basis for peace between Arab and Jew is the coherence of the impulses of the Arab Renaissance to the principles of 2,000 years of Jewish survival in Europe. The function of regional economic development is to unleash a cultural renaissance among both Arabs and Jews of the region, to establish the movement for stability within each nation, and to foster among the nations a common view of the dignity of the individual, such that the life of the person of each nation is sacred to all nations. Economic development by itself will not suffice to bring the desired renaissance into existence, but that renaissance cannot be effected without a basis in vigorous economic development. And that is the only approach that will take us out of the imperial control, which uses victimization, which uses the idea of the aura of power, the beast man able to impose its will. We have to break out of that, which is the geopolitical doctrine. And in doing so, establish this higher sense of identity, which is unknown except as an enemy to the lords and ladies of London. And so I think in conclusion, we can say the truth has lived a wretched life, but the battle is not lost. And we cannot stop now because reality is asserting itself. And so I would urge people watching us today to join us to win this fight. It's a fight that can be won.
It was something that you raised, Harley, I wanted to make sure I asked about. And that was the period of 1992 and the discussions concerning the pullout of the settlements and Rabin and what he was saying and what Shamir was saying. Can you tell us a little bit more here about the actual factional battle within Israeli politics on this?
Well, from the beginning, there was within the Israeli leadership a sense that what we now call the occupied territory, because it was taken over after the 67 war, that there was a need for settlements there as defense outposts. And Rabin was a supporter of that, but not as a permanent settlement policy for the Jewish state. What he said is that we need these defensive outposts to keep an eye on what's happening. But what Shamir and before him Menachem Begin, who was also from the Jabotinsky crowd, and then especially under Sharon and Netanyahu, the idea was to flood these areas with Jewish settlers so that it would be impossible to establish a contiguous territory for a Palestinian state. And that's what they were doing. But it was costly. And so Shamir went to the Bush administration and asked for money. You know, in the typical way these people see the United States as the piggy bank for these fascist movements. And what for some reason, and this may have to do a lot with realpolitik, with other kinds of situations that were going on at the time. Remember, that was the time of the Gulf War against Saddam and so on. The Bush administration basically said, we'll give you the money, but you have to at least put up a pretense of dealing with the unrest in the Palestinian population. And so Shamir agreed to have a discussion at Madrid, but he did not agree to stop the settlements. And they continued to build up the settlements in what they called Judea and Samaria. And this became an increasing point of tension in places such as Hebron, because it was in Hebron where one of these Brooklyn-born extremists went into a mosque and killed 29 people, I think, Baruch Goldstein. So you had this tension in this area. And so Rabin, as part of his initial shift toward a discussion process, called for a freeze on the settlements. Now, it's not clear whether they actually did freeze them during that period. There was not a great deal of increase in population. But since Netanyahu's been back in 2009, there's been a tremendous increase in the number of settlements. I have the numbers here somewhere, how many there are. But this is part of what Sharon called facts on the ground. How can you have a Palestinian state if the land belongs to Jewish settlers? And so that was the fraud that was perpetrated that undermined the potential for a two-state solution.
Yeah. Now, you also referenced several times when you were talking Lyndon LaRouche's various initiatives around Southwest Asia and particularly the Israel-Palestine conflict in particular. Actually, those began around about 1975, but then the Likud party came to power, I believe it was in 1977. And there was a great shock at the time. I know, in fact, we included in Executive Intelligence Review back in the spring of that period, interviews with British Zionists who said that they were completely stunned by the fact that Menachem Begin's Likud could have come to power because it was known as a terrorist formation. So in 73, the Labour Party was in power. By 77, Likud was out. LaRouche's interventions began approximately 75, and they seemed to have some real resonance. But then, of course, there was the Lebanon War of 75. There are many other things that occurred. So when you're looking at this period later, the one that we are just talking about, 92, 93, Netanyahu and his politics really go back to this earlier Likud development. Isn't that correct? And to what degree have we seen a shift either back in the direction of peace? Of course, it's hard to say given what's going on there now, or to what degree did these forces become so ensconced in Israel that is no longer or doesn't seem to be a real prospect?
Well, the situation in Israel is highly polarized, and Netanyahu himself is an example of a minority government where he has to pull together a coalition which includes some of the religious parties, some of the out-and-out racist parties like the old Kahani networks, the Koch party. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's his national security advisor, comes out of Koch, comes out of the Kahani networks, and believes that the Palestinians should either accept a second or third class status of existing with no rights, or be kicked out of Israel altogether. Mm-hmm. So you have this Netanyahu Greater Israel faction, which goes back to Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was openly a fascist, who admired Mussolini, who wrote a letter to Hitler saying that if you would drop your anti-Semitism, we would gladly support you. And Jabotinsky was a deployment out of the British-controlled Zionist movement, which essentially was to counter the more rational networks around Ben-Gurion. And so this tradition goes back to the 1920s. And there have been constant battles that sometimes included assassinations. What became the Likud party, previously Herut party, was responsible for the blowing up of the King David Hotel. In fact, Shamir may have been personally involved in that. You talk about the Palestinian Liberation Organization as terrorist. Well, that's exactly what Shamir and Begin were in the 40s, in the period leading up to the end of the British Mandate and the establishment of the State of Israel. So this tradition is there, and it's explicitly a commitment to the land from the Nile to the Tigris and Euphrates. That's what they call Greater Israel. And they say sooner or later that will be Greater Israel. Well, what about Jordan? What about Lebanon? What about Egypt? This is essentially what has provoked the sense within the Arab population that you can't trust negotiations with Israel. That did change with Rabin. The fact that Arafat went to Washington and shook Rabin's hand, he renounced terrorism. In Leah Rabin's book, she talks about some of the meetings she had with Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat and his wife, where they actually found them to be very open and very good partners. And this is, something that could not have been predicted 4 or 5 years earlier. So the problem with, as Avi Shlaim writes in this book, The Iron Wall, the problem is the so-called revisionist Zionist, which is the Jabotinsky wing, had no intention of allowing a portion of the old Palestine to be under the control of Palestinians, the Palestinian Arabs. And so it's very clear that this is why Netanyahu is the promoter of perpetual war and conflict, because that's his approach to the situation. And the only way to counter that, as Lynn pointed out, is not simply economics, but by looking at the adversary and recognize that they have the same basic human interests that you have. This idea of the benefit of the other, which ironically, I quoted this thing, one God, so many enemies. This is the irony in the Middle East, because you have the birthplace of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And yet, with the same one God, why so much warfare? And it's based on this outside intervention to prevent there from being a recognition of the common interests and the coordination of creative people to make the deserts bloom. And that's what the Oasis Plan of LaRouche was about. Make the deserts bloom. Make this a land of milk and honey, of plenty. And that's how you solve this problem.
Mm-hmm. I have another question for you pertaining to some remarks that Scott Ritter recently made. But I wanted to see if we may have some video from the demonstrations and rallies that are going on today. In Washington, actually, there's a rally also in Berlin. There's a rally in Paris. There are rallies going on, I think, also London, several others. We don't think we have footage from all of those, but do we have any video that we can show at this point? If we don't have it right now, let's get it ready. And I'll ask you the question now, Harley. Scott Ritter has been commenting in the last couple of days about the military circumstance. He has a certain evaluation. I'll say a little bit about it and then just ask your view, not of his military evaluation, but of some of the implications of what he's saying. He points out that however you want to think about it, what happened on October 7th caught the Israeli military completely by surprise. Even if people who subscribe to the theory that it was allowed to occur, even if you take that into account, it still caught them completely by surprise. And that from the standpoint of what Hamas's objective was, that one of the objectives was to put the question of a two-state solution back on the table. He points out, however brutal you may think that is, however you may wish to see it, he said, the fact of the matter is that the conditions of life that existed in Gaza, which is a kind of open-air concentration camp, as he put it, meant that an attack like that being carried out, then causing the Israelis to retaliate, that there's a problem. And the problem is that it is urban, guerrilla warfare, and you're trying to move into a city which you have already blown apart in large part, and that makes it even more difficult for your military operations to be carried out. He talked about how the Israeli army of today is not the same as the Israeli army of 30 years ago, and it is not prepared to go in and do that kind of attack. They may have units or surgical units or groupings that have that kind of capability or qualification. He said you have to think about it the way that the Russian troops that have gone into Bakhmut have had to be deployed. You have to be in extraordinarily good physical condition because you have to be able to carry 40 or 50 pounds of equipment. And that equipment actually protects you from being killed or shot. You have to be able to run with that kind of equipment. You have to be able to do that in Gaza. And he said that you do not have those kinds of forces, in his view, among the Israeli military. With all that said, his point is that the kind of random, indiscriminate bombing that actually is going on, which is being called surgical, but of course it's in one of the most densely populated areas in the world, means that you're going to kill thousands of people if you continue it. And of course, that's what has in fact happened. We're up around about 10,000 casualties, approximately, killed, about 65% of whom are women and children, and about half of whom are children. And that an attempt to try to extend this means that you have to be prepared to take massive or significant casualties on the Israeli side as well. He doesn't believe that they're capable of doing that, not politically capable of doing that. Now, this, of course, is a situation of carnage. We all know this is happening hour by hour, and in fact, the world is becoming more and more incensed and outraged and convulsed and revolted by it. But with that said, there's also been an upsurge worldwide, and in Israel as well, of people of goodwill who are trying to get not minimally a ceasefire, but also a set of negotiations. Now, given the kind of geometry that you've already described, what do you think has to happen? I know Helga Sepler-Ruschel at the top of our hour, for people that didn't see it, described her view of what would need to be done. But what's your view of not so much what's going to happen, but what the next steps need to be in the situation there?
Well, again, I think if you start from the approach of Lyndon LaRouche, you have to figure out how to move outside of the framework of the so-called Arab-Israeli crisis. I think in this light, it's very interesting what Colonel Douglas Macgregor said, and also Jeffrey Sachs had the very same comment. He said, what's necessary to save Israel is to save Israel from itself, from Netanyahu. And I think a growing number of people within Israel, even people who have been shocked and angered by the attacks on October 7th, blame Netanyahu. They blame him for not moving more toward peace. They blame him for weakening the defense sector, or having an arrogance about the inability of the Hamas to defend itself. And so there's this growing sense within Israel that, and it's expressed in this form, well, let's finish this off, let's finish the operation and then get rid of Netanyahu. Well, that's for the Israeli people. But the bigger question then is, what about the rest of the world? And that's why I started with the situation in Ukraine. We've seen, estimates are anywhere from 250,000 to 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers who have been killed in this war, which should never have taken place. Putin's desire was not to conquer Ukraine, because if he wanted to, he could destroy Ukraine. He's got the weapons, he's got the capability. What he's doing is what is, in a sense, a surgical operation to go after the NATO ability to use Ukraine as a base against Russia. And most military analysts say that's already been accomplished. But why is the West continuing to call for more money? Why did Biden ask for another $60 billion for Ukraine? Why is Biden asking for another 14+ billion for Israel? Well, this is where you see the outside control. This is not about protecting Israel or protecting Ukraine. It's about destabilizing the possibility of a move out of the unipolar order. And what's the character of the unipolar order? It's that the interests of those who are pulling the strings, and the financial cartels, the corporate cartels, as I mentioned earlier, the lords and ladies of London, their desire is to, at all costs, stop the emergence of a system outside of the control of London and Wall Street. And that's what Helga keeps emphasizing. That's the bigger fight. So what we've got to do is get people in Europe and in the United States to recognize something that they already know, which is that they're not benefiting from these wars. In fact, they're suffering. There's what we've called the boomerang effect. The sanctions against Russia means there's no longer cheap oil and gas available in Europe. Germany is heading into a recession. The consumer confidence has collapsed. The spending on goods and services is dropping, I think, 4% last month. In the United States, we have an extremely weak economic situation. But people are still tolerating that at the point at which they're seeing money going into these wars, and that's starting to change. And what has to be done is to connect the emergence of a new security and development architecture to the opposition to the control of governments by these corporate cartels on behalf of these families internationally who are trying to impose a top-down order and to prevent the opposition from uniting by using these wars. So that's really the solution. You know, it has an economic component, but to really get people to be inspired to go to the streets, you have to pose the question to them of how does any nation benefit by killing children of another nation? How does it improve your circumstances to be part of a country which has a president, Biden, who says we want to help with the humanitarian concerns, but at the same time give another $14.5 billion to them to carry out the war? You know, these contradictions ought to become clear to people. And I think what we've done is we've just produced a new pamphlet. I don't know if we have a way to post it up on the screen, but a new pamphlet on the OASIS plan is the solution, which people can, there it is, the LaRouche OASIS plan. People can download it, they can circulate it, they can discuss it. This is what Helga was talking about. Let's get a real debate going on these questions. Because the fight, look, the Congress is now, and I hope we can get Cliff back on to discuss this, but how are they manipulating the fight in the Congress? You've got these so-called Christian fundamentalists, which make up a significant portion of the Republican Party, who some of them are what are called premillennial dispensationalists. They believe that we're headed toward the Battle of Armageddon. And according to ministers such as John Hagee of the Cornerstone Baptist Church in San Antonio, a number of pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention, they're demanding full support to Israel because they say that Israel is God's chosen instrument to bring Jesus Christ back. And how does that work? Well, Hagee in his book talks about the Battle of Armageddon will be triggered by the return of most of the Jews of the world to Israel, where they'll be in a battle for survival, and they'll only survive if they accept Jesus as their Messiah. And so essentially he's talking about most of the Jewish population being destroyed in a war in the Middle East, supposedly as a pro-Jewish sentiment. Now, if people understood that that's what is being used, you see the vote that just took place in the Congress, where in the House of Representatives, the Republicans pushed through a separate funding bill on the Israel question because many of those Republicans have come to see the Ukraine situation as hopeless. And what Biden was trying to do was to use the linkage between the funding for Ukraine and Israel to say we've got to stand up against the authoritarians and stand up for democracy. And in that sense, for the war hawks like Blinken and others, the Hamas attack on Israel was like manna falling from heaven. It gave them the justification to increase the overall amount of funds going to these wars. So if people understand these contradictions, you don't get peace by killing. We have a whole history of humanity that demonstrates that. One of the examples Helga's been using is what happened after World War I. The policy of revenge against Germany with the Versailles Treaty. What did it do? It further weakened an already harmed German economy from the effects of World War I and created the chaos that led to the ability to impose the Hitler regime. How did that help Germany? How did that help the world? So we know that the idea of vengeance doesn't bring peace. But nevertheless, people are going to church, to some of these churches like Hagee's church, and cheering for a war to the end in the Battle of Armageddon on the plains of Megiddo, which is essentially Israel, against, and as Hagee said, it's against Russia, against China, and against Persia. Well, doesn't that fit nicely with the neocons who say we have to demoralize or demilitarize Russia, defeat China as an enemy, and also destroy Iran? So if you get above this, if you understand that you're being played, and this is, I think, the importance of Lyndon LaRouche's approach to history, philosophy, economics as a single unity. That's what we have to get across to people. It's not as hard as it sounds because people are already suffering and they're looking for alternatives. Unfortunately, too often they look for the simple alternative, which is not a truthful solution to the problem.
Well, one of the things that you're raising with Dag Harley, just to say, and we're going to show a little video short of what we have from Washington, D.C., what's going on down there, is looking at the operations which are referred to as the fundamentalist or millenarian or apocalyptic or messianic operations. These are largely the product of the old intelligence operation called the John Foster Dulles' World Council of Churches. That doesn't mean the people in the World Council of Churches of today are part of an intelligence operation. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to the fact that in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Dulles brothers, through a combination of projects, including the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the course of both Germany and then extended out, and then on the religious front, through what they called their World Council of Churches, sought to create these kinds of what were then called Cold War belief structures and organizations that control belief structures. There are various forms of ideological warfare. And what you've raised just now is an important thing for people to think about. Matter of fact, it's a question that we got from the chat, which we will go to in just a minute. Can we just show the video that we have now from Washington?
And doing everything you can for Palestine. And that's all, y'all. We have Palestinians here.
And that's just enough of a certain amount of this shot that we got from Jose, from the section of the rally that he was able to see. Here's the question that we got, which is the following. Didn't the Palestinians elect Hamas as their government? I used to find such peace and inspiration listening to this channel, but you are so off course on this one. Okay, so that's the question. So if you would address that, and I'm actually going to say something about that as well after you.
Well, first of all, the person who asks that doesn't have any idea probably that Netanyahu funded Hamas and built them up at a point at which the Palestinian population of Gaza was desperate. And Hamas had money, and Hamas was able to bring in food, medicine, and certain kinds of improvements in conditions of life. That was Netanyahu's strategy. And the fact that, however it happened, Hamas was able to escape out of Gaza and launched the attacks on October 7th ought to raise some questions. So, the idea that, that because Hamas did something that was horrible, therefore we should support the destruction of Gaza doesn't make sense. But this is the kind of manipulation that occurs. Now, let me just go back a second to this fundamentalism question, because the actual source of religious fundamentalism in the United States is, not surprisingly, Britain. And the premillennial dispensationism goes back to the Darbyites, a British pastor named Darby, who in 1859 came to the United States and set up a whole series of churches, also to Canada, which preached this idea of Armageddon is coming, the final battle, and you have to be on the side of the Lord. And this has to do with the battle. And at that time, it was, there wasn't a state of Israel. So this predates by almost 100 years the establishment of the state of Israel. And these kinds of revivals occurred periodically when there are economic crises, when there's war. Think about the idea of 1859. It's right before the Civil War. So you have these kinds of things that are launched out of Oxford, out of the Freemasonic, Scottish Rite Freemasonic networks that promote these things. Albert Pike was a part of this, and the KKK. So, these kinds of manipulations, we can demonstrate historically where they come from and how they're used. The question is, how do you break people who are desperate, who think their life is not so good, and they're looking for the afterlife as a solution, or something of that sort. So, you can see how this preys on people, and then you have the Congress, where you have the new Speaker of the House is part of this, and I don't know enough about him yet, but apparently what he's told people and what's been written about him is that he belongs to one of these Armageddonist churches. And so naturally for him, he's willing to fund Israel to do whatever the Israelis think they have to do to destroy Hamas, even if it ultimately will destroy Israel, as people like Scott Ritter and Douglas McGregor and Jeffrey Sachs have said. So I think the answer to that question is the person just doesn't know enough to make an assessment. The fact that somebody commits a heinous crime doesn't mean that everyone who lives in the vicinity of that person should be killed. And that's essentially what we're seeing now, that even people at in the State Department are now starting to, we had a resignation of a top State Department official, the resignation that Helga mentioned of a top UN official, the statement from Guterres, that the UN General Secretary, about being appalled by what he's seeing happen in Gaza. As I said at the beginning, reality is going to hit. And the question is, will people retreat into what they have as comfortable axioms, or will they break out of it and look at the bigger picture and say, okay, what can I do to bring peace? And that's why the two people that I've been talking about in the work that I'm doing provide an inspiration. Rabin, who we've talked about extensively today, but the other one is John Kennedy. We're coming up on the anniversary of his assassination. Why was Kennedy killed? He was breaking out of the axioms of the Cold War that Lynn described as Trumanism, with his rapprochement with the Soviet Union after the near annihilation of humanity with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So use these examples to recognize that it is within the realm of human existence to have leaders who break from the control. And the thing we have to do is make sure they stay alive, because they become targets very quickly.
It's from Russell. He said the following: claiming lands anywhere based on history is ridiculous. Let's take back everything Genghis Khan took and compensate anyone who has his DNA. And he goes on and says other things. It's like a guy calling me a slave trader when both of us are neither slave nor trader. It's Marxist ideology to divide and conquer in all cases. That's just his comment. I'll just say one thing on that. Clearly, talking about ancient kingdoms becomes problematic, because then you're talking about Assyria, not Syria, Persia, not Iran, Babylon, not Iraq, Phoenicia, not Lebanon, Lower Egypt, Pharaohaic Egypt, excuse me, not Egypt, and of course Judea and Samaria. So it is true that certainly when it's romantically referred to by Christian fundamentalists in the United States, it certainly poses an issue. But I think the other element is that it's imperial. You were just talking about old or ancient empires. You're not talking about republican nation states. So I'll just reference that. So I'll, I don't know if you have a comment on that.
I have a quick thought on that, Dennis, because what we're talking about in this region in Southwest Asia, in the modern era, this was the crossroads of empires. As you mentioned, it was the end of the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. The British were afraid the Russian Empire would come in and grab it. The French put their claim in with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And however it happened, there were the establishment of what was generally accepted as nations. Now, the question is, how do you assure the rights of people within those nations? And what happened with the 1948 war, and you can get into this whole question of why didn't the Arab governments accept Israel and so on. But what happened is that the land that was held by Palestinians was taken from them. It became over between 48 and 67, it became the occupied territories. Now, the question then is, what should be the role of superpowers today to decide which country is more justified in controlling the area than the other, or to work out negotiated agreements which provide the basis for sovereign existence of nations? And what we're seeing, which is most positive, is around the emergence of the BRICS, is countries that had fights in the post-World War II period to establish independence in Africa, for example, but were still, in a sense, under neo-colonial control, are now asserting their sovereignty. And the question then is, can you have agreements that will benefit the neighbors of those states and the people who live in those countries? Clearly, for example, Niger, where the French were basically taking out the uranium to use for their nuclear power production of electricity in France and paying almost nothing for it to Niger, that's a colonial system. This is where you see the control by the empires of the terms of trade and finance and so on. Now, what's starting to emerge in the so-called multipolar world is the potential for negotiations, not just on borders and things of that sort, but on how to have a credit system which will assure that every country has the basis for providing for the needs of its population. That's where the LaRouche economics idea comes in. That if you don't have a sovereign credit system, if you're dependent on globalist bankers who are interested only in cheap labor and cheap raw materials, sovereignty is meaningless. But if you actually have a system which allows nations to develop their resources and develop their population, because the most important resource is the labor power and the creativity of their population. If you have agreements on that basis, which is why Lynn talked about the Renaissance tradition of the Arab world and the Renaissance tradition of the Jewish population in Israel, then you have the basis for agreements that don't come down to who had this land first. So I think what we're really looking at, and it's an irony because we hear all the talk about the rules-based order. There are no rules in the rules-based order. The rule is who has the power rules. And that's ending. That system is collapsing. And so the question is, for every nation, including Israel, including the Palestinians, including the people of Niger and South Africa and Argentina, will these nations have an ability to engage in diplomatic and economic relations with other nations on the basis of justice and equality. And if you have that, you can always work out boundary disputes and things of that sort. But if you don't have that, you have nothing but a Hobbesian universe of the survival of the fittest, the law of the jungle. And so that's really the issue that we're addressing.
This is what I wanted to point out, Harley, because there's other questions that are beginning to come in, but as has been commented, they're sort of all over the place. And there's something I just want to sort of address just more generally. There are tens of thousands of people, of course, in Washington now. This section that we saw of the rally is just sort of a pro-Palestinian rally. We're not really trying to do that. We're doing something completely different. So for those people that are in the chat room and may have a confusion about this, I just want to say something very clearly about it. The issue here is actually the piece of land that Gaza sits on can be one of the most productive in the world, because actually it doesn't have to do with resources. It has to do with human resources. And it has to do with the fact that there are policies that are afoot and have been afoot from particularly the time of the environmentalist movement to prevent the deployment of advanced technologies to Southwest Asia. A lot of times this is masqueraded around the idea of preventing the area from having nuclear weapons, although Israel has nuclear weapons. And they talk about the idea of Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and that's the big issue. But in fact, and in reality, even the Shah of Iran, who was an American asset, was deposed by the United States and the City of London at the point that he attempted to move from an oil-based economy to a nuclear-based economy. And he proposed the building of 24 nuclear power plants, 8 of which were supposed to be built by the United States. At the point that that policy, which was a advanced technology moving and transitioning from oil, was being proposed by him, he was deposed by the people that put him into power, with a series of governments that then succeeded him. The same thing was done in a different way to Iraq, and for different reasons. The secular-based governments of the Islamic world were all deposed through various variations of Muslim Brotherhood and related religious operations, which were always in contention with the secular form in which the Islamic governments attempted to be transitioned. This didn't mean these were perfect governments. Didn't mean there were not all sorts of problems there. But what we're looking at right now in Southwest Asia is the prospect for turning off this earlier policy of deindustrialization and enforced backwardness by means of the Russia, China, and inclusive now of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, United Arab Emirates, potential alliance, Egypt as well, and Ethiopia around the BRICS nations. What this would mean is that you would be able to talk about the idea of technological progress in general for the area, with peace being a function of or derived from this addressing of the economic needs, for example, water and water desalination, which is the most important thing for Southwest Asia, more important than oil. These are the capabilities, the technological capabilities, including those that Israel has, particularly in the nuclear field, are a part of what would have to be discussed or put on the table for discussion for this area of Southwest Asia, both as a crossroads of Africa, Europe, and Asia, but also from the standpoint of reversing the earlier depopulation policies and deindustrialization policies that were imposed on this area. Now, many different heads of state have been either assassinated or removed from these areas. And it's not merely Sadat, not merely Rabin, not merely in different ways and different times, good and bad people, all of whom had some notion of improving their nations. This has to be something that we reverse. And it's something that when we look at particularly Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and we look at leaders, including al-Sisi and others in the area now, this is the actual basis upon which negotiations will probably begin to occur. Even the Saudis, Turki al-Faisal, former intelligence head of Saudi Arabia from 1979 to 2001, talked about the need of a non-violent movement in Palestine. That's not a new idea for Palestine. Back in 2018, there were very large demonstrations in the tens of thousands, which were nonviolent demonstrations that happened in Gaza. Many of those people were killed, murdered, in fact, by persons at Israeli Defense Forces, and so forth, even as they tried to protest nonviolently. Nonetheless, the fact that that idea has come up, the fact that these ideas are now on the table, means that we could be looking at a completely revolutionary situation that comes out of this tragedy, this set of war crimes that's presently being committed. There are bigger issues here, far bigger than anything having to do with Israel and Palestine. That's why you've got the U.S. there with that massive presence, as we see. That's why Hezbollah is making statements. That's why Iran is making statements. And it's important that we look at the bigger picture and think of ourselves as intervening where we are by taking a global approach to a new security and development architecture. So I just wanted to put that in, Harley. I think probably the best thing we can do is probably go to a summary, which you should probably do, Harley, on what your thinking is. Anything that we haven't yet been able to get across or need to add at the picture at this point.
Well, I would just add one thing to what I had presented earlier, which is this push for a war against Iran, which is coming from people like Joe Lieberman. Lieberman's tied to something called the United Against the Nuclear Iran, which is a classic example of one of these British-controlled think tanks. It includes a number of different people who are James Woolsey, the former CIA director. It promotes the ideas of John Bolton. But it's interesting that this is an organization that is out in the Republican Party right now, pushing Nikki Haley. They're trying to build with also Lindsey Graham and others, but build up this head of steam to say Iran is responsible for the October 7th attack, and Iran has to pay the price. Lindsey Graham is saying destroy their oil infrastructure and so on. But just to make one point on this, in 2012, this United Against the Nuclear Iran think tank formed a partnership with the London-based Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And this is an organization which is supposedly focused on countering misinformation and disinformation, partnering with Google, Microsoft, Meta, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Open Society of Soros. So some of the conservatives running around saying we have to target Iran are actually finding themselves in bed with Soros and Bill Gates and people they claim they don't like. That's why you have to look at the bigger picture, because people can get manipulated. And the bigger picture is that the human race is facing an incredible crisis right now. And that's what Helga was talking about at the beginning. Don't run away from it. We do face the prospect, if we can't bring these wars to an end, that sooner or later these wars could lead to an accident which ends up with the destruction of humanity in a nuclear conflagration. So when we're talking about these things and appealing to our viewers to organize and to become bigger than you think you are, you have to realize there are a lot of people looking for answers. They don't know who to trust. But if you make yourself a vehicle of the truth and the fight for the truth, then you can find that you have an effect that goes far beyond anything you thought previously. You look at what Lyndon LaRouche was able to do in his presidential campaigns because of the slanders, the attacks, the vote fraud, and everything else. He never got many percentage of the vote, although he did do quite well in a couple primaries. And that's what scared them. But nevertheless, he influenced governments all over the world, and those policies are now coming into existence with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the BRICS policies, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. So can one person make a difference? Well, that's why I talked about Rabin. That's why I brought up Kennedy. And that's why I'm talking now about LaRouche. There's no reason why our listeners can't become part of this movement and make sure that we grow and that we have the financial base to get out these pamphlets, get out our webcasts far and wide, so that we can fill the vacuum with real ideas and real debate, because that's the only thing that can save our civilization now.
Harley Slanger, thank you very much for today. We'll have Cliff Kirikow back on. We'll try for next week. As was mentioned, we have a pamphlet which we've put out on this matter, which is now in circulation, including at that rally in Washington, D.C. It could be available from otherwise. Schiller Institute actually is the author of that pamphlet. And we'll just say concerning the matter that was discussed at the beginning of our broadcast by Helga Zepp LaRouche, that everybody should get involved right now, whether that be in forms of demonstration or whether that be petitioning Congress, or whether that be if you're, for example, just a believer in the idea that there should be a cessation of these actual killings. You have a member of a church or church organization and so on. Take an action that places you outside of the present kind of carnage and outside of the present paradigm that demands that that's the only solution. War is the only answer. War is not the answer. And war in a thermonuclear era is definitely not the answer. We intend and will continue to make people aware as these developments break of ways in which they can help, ways in which they can deploy, ways in which they can organize. And our commitment is that the kind of ideas that Lyndon LaRouche represented, particularly when it came to this area of the world and other areas of conflict, ideas which involved economic development policies and programs thoroughly thought through, thoroughly detailed, but which have not been acted on because of the suppression of his voice back in the 1980s and 1990s. These are the solutions that are available. So tragedy is not necessary. There is not only hope for the future, but there's an actual pathway to that future. And so on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank you all for listening to us, and we'll see you here again next week.